There is a moment, in the life of every enormous thing, when the weight of what it has become is no longer supported by what it actually is. When the gap between the story it tells about itself and the reality it inhabits grows so wide that no amount of repetition can bridge it. You can tell the story louder. You can print it in larger letters. You can build monuments to it in every city square. But somewhere in the back of the mind of every person who reads those letters and walks past those monuments, a quieter, more truthful voice is speaking. And once that voice starts, it is almost impossible to silence. This is a story about that moment, about what happens when the most powerful ideological project of the 20th century, a project that reshaped a sixth of the Earth's landmass, that launched the first satellite into space, that terrified half the planet for 4 decades, simply stopped being believable. Not defeated, not destroyed, not conquered by a superior army, stopped being believed. The Soviet Union did not fall because someone won a war against it. There was no final battle. No victorious general accepting a surrender. No moment when the last soldier laid down his rifle and the flag was lowered in defeat. What happened instead was something stranger, and in some ways more frightening. An empire dissolved because the people inside it, the engineers, the teachers, the bureaucrats, the soldiers, the farmers, the ordinary men and women who made the machinery of the state turn, quietly, gradually, almost imperceptibly, stopped believing it was real. That is the question this script wants to hold. Not just what happened. The history is documented, the dates are known, but how? How does a system that controlled the thoughts, the movements, the very language of 300 million people simply lose its grip? What does ideological collapse actually feel like from the inside? What is it like to wake up one morning and realize that the world you were taught to inhabit no longer exists, not because it was taken from you, but because it was never quite what you thought? And maybe the more uncomfortable question, has this happened before? Does it happen still? Not just in the Soviet Union, but in smaller rooms, in the minds of individuals. In the quiet hours when the story you've been telling yourself about your own life suddenly rings false, when the gap between who you thought you were and who you actually are becomes, finally, too wide to ignore. The Soviet Union fell in 1991, but its dissolution began decades before any politician announced it. It began in the silence between the official words, in the jokes people told in kitchens at night, in the invisible ledger that every citizen kept, privately, of all the things they were told and all the things they saw, and the growing, aching distance between those two columns. To understand the fall of the Soviet Union, you have to understand something about the nature of collective belief, about how a society holds itself together not just through force, though force matters, but through shared story. The Soviet state was, among other things, one of the most ambitious storytelling projects in human history. It told a story about the direction of time, about the meaning of suffering, about who the enemies were, and who the heroes were, and what the future was going to look like. And for a while in the early years, in the heat of revolution and industrial transformation and war, that story was told with a kind of ferocious conviction that swept millions of people along with it. But stories are fragile things. They require constant tending. They require that enough of the people inside them continue to believe, or at least continue to act as though they believe, for the story to maintain its shape. And the Soviet story, in its later decades, developed a particular and fatal quality. It became a story that everyone knew was not quite true, but that no one was permitted to say was not quite true. A performance of belief, maintained with enormous effort, by people who had largely stopped believing. This is what is sometimes called the condition of living in a lie. And it is worth sitting with that phrase for a moment, because it names something more precise than simple dishonesty. Living in a lie is not the same as being lied to. It is something more active, more exhausting. It is the daily labor of a person who participates in the maintenance of a false account of reality, who says things they do not believe, who pretends to see things that are not there, who performs loyalty to a story they privately find unconvincing. It is, in a quiet but profound way, a form of self-betrayal, and self-betrayal maintained over years and decades does something to a person. It does something to a culture. The Czech dissident Václav Havel wrote about this. He wrote about a greengrocer who, every morning, places a sign in his shop window that reads, "Workers of the world, unite." He does not believe it. He does not even think about it. He puts the sign up because not putting it up would invite trouble, and yet the act of putting the sign up, day after day, year after year, contributes to something. It contributes to a world in which that sign is everywhere, which means it contributes to a world in which dissent feels impossible. He is not just a victim of the system. He is, in some small but real way, a maker of it. Havel wrote this in 1978 about Czechoslovakia, but he could have written it about Moscow, about Leningrad, about Kiev, about any city in the vast machinery of the Soviet state where millions of greengrocers and millions of teachers and millions of factory workers and millions of party officials were placing their signs in their windows every morning, and contributing thereby to the architecture of a world that no one quite believed in but that everyone helped maintain. This is where the fall of the Soviet Union really begins. Not in 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. Not in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down. Not in August 1991, when a group of hardliners attempted a coup and found that no one was willing to fight for them. It begins decades earlier, in the growing gap between the story and the lived reality. In the kitchens where people said at night what they could not say in public. In the private ledgers of disbelief that were accumulating invisibly across 300 million lives. And once you see it this way, once you understand that the collapse was not a sudden rupture, but the final visible expression of a slow internal erosion, the real question becomes, when exactly did the belief stop? Where precisely was the moment when the story lost its grip? Was it a single event? A single generation? Or was it something more diffuse? A gradual cooling like a fire that burns lower and lower until one morning you come downstairs and find that there are only ashes, and you cannot say with any certainty which hour the last ember went out? To understand what was lost, you have to understand what was promised. And the promise of the Bolshevik Revolution was, by any measure, extraordinary. It was not a modest promise. It was not a promise to improve the tax system or reform the judiciary. It was a promise to remake the human condition, to end, once and for all, the exploitation of one person by another, to create a society in which the fruits of human labor were shared equally, in which no one was hungry while others feasted, in which the direction of history was finally consciously in the hands of the people who made it. This was 1917. The world had just watched 4 years of industrial slaughter in the trenches of the First World War. The old empires of Europe were collapsing. The old certainties about progress, about civilization, about the beneficence of the ruling class had been shredded in the mud of the Somme and Verdun. The world was looking for a new story, and the Bolsheviks offered one. Vladimir Lenin was 47 years old when he stepped off the sealed train at the Finland station in Petrograd in April 1917. He had spent most of his adult life in exile, in Switzerland, in London, in Geneva, refining the theory of what the revolution should look like and waiting for the moment when it would become possible. He was not a romantic. He had almost no sentimentality about the suffering that the revolution would require. He believed with the cold conviction of a chess player thinking several moves ahead that the violence and sacrifice of the revolutionary period were necessary, not desirable, but necessary, in order to arrive at the society on the other side. You can argue, and many have argued, about whether Lenin's vision was ever achievable. Whether the gap between the ideal and the human material, between the theory of a society of equals and the reality of actual people with their selfishness and their tribalism and their hunger for power, was always too wide. Whether the turn toward dictatorship and terror, which came so quickly after the revolution, was an inevitable consequence of the original premises, or whether there were branching points, moments when things could have gone differently. What you cannot argue is that the promise was real, that it moved people, that in the early years of the Soviet project millions of men and women genuinely believed they were living at the hinge of history, that they were the generation that would finally, after millennia of suffering and exploitation, build the world that human beings deserved. There is something in the testimonies of that period, the diaries, the letters, the memoirs, that is almost unbearable to read, knowing what we know about what came next. A luminous, fierce, uncomplicated faith. The kind of faith that moves mountains, the kind of faith that can also justify atrocity when the distance between the present reality and the promised future becomes, in the believer's mind, not a reason to question the faith, but a reason to press harder. The first decade of Soviet power was catastrophic in ways that its architects did not fully predict and its supporters did not fully acknowledge. The civil war that followed the revolution killed perhaps 10 million people through fighting and famine and disease. Lenin's new economic policy, introduced in 1921 as a tactical retreat from pure communism, briefly allowed private markets to function and the economy began to recover. But Lenin died in 1924, and what followed was the struggle for succession, and then the rise of Joseph Stalin, and then the full horror of what collectivization and the terror would bring. And here is the crucial thing about Stalin, the thing that matters most for the story of the Soviet collapse. He inherited the promise, but he transformed what it meant to believe in it. Under Lenin, belief in the revolution had been, in however distorted a form, a belief in a real project with real stakes. Under Stalin, belief became something else. It became a performance, a ritual, a protective incantation. You said the words not because you believed them, but because not saying them could get you killed. And the person next to you said the words not because they believed them, but because not saying them could get them killed. And so the words were said everywhere, all the time, by everyone, and the volume of the words was mistaken by the state, and sometimes by the speakers themselves for conviction. This is the beginning of the Soviet lie in its mature form. Not the beginning of propaganda. Propaganda is as old as power, but the beginning of something more specific, the institutionalization of performed belief, the creation of a society in which the gap between public speech and private thought was not an aberration, but a structural feature, in which everyone knew privately that what was said in public was not quite true, and everyone knew that everyone else knew this, and yet the public performance continued because the alternative was unthinkable. Stalin died in 1953. The grief, and there was grief, genuine grief across the Soviet Union. Tens of thousands of people weeping in the streets for a man who had terrorized them for 3 decades, was one of the most psychologically complex events in modern history. How do you mourn the person who murdered your friends, your family, your neighbors? How do you account for the fact that you are weeping, that the tears feel real, that somewhere beneath all the performance and the terror something that functions like love or like need, which is sometimes confused with love, has formed? The answer, perhaps, is that human beings are not simple, that we are capable of holding contradictions that should be logically impossible. That 3 decades of pervasive, penetrating ideology that began with children in school, that shaped the language, that made dissent feel not just dangerous, but literally unthinkable, can create a kind of interior colonization, so deep that the colonized can no longer fully distinguish between what they were taught to feel and what they actually feel. Nikita Khrushchev understood this better than almost anyone. In 1956, 3 years after Stalin's death, Khrushchev stood before the 20th Party Congress and delivered what became known as the secret speech. He named the crimes. He described the purges. He said, in the most powerful political institution in the Soviet Union, in front of the men who ran the country, that Stalin had been a criminal, that the show trials had been fabricated, that the men and women who had been executed for treason had been innocent. He said all of this, and the room was reportedly silent in a way that rooms are rarely silent, the silence not of emptiness, but of enormous, barely contained shock. The speech was supposed to be a controlled demolition. Khrushchev believed he had to believe that acknowledging the crimes of the past would allow the system to continue in a purified, more legitimate form, that you could drain the poison without killing the patient. But what he could not have fully anticipated was what the speech would do to the larger architecture of Soviet belief, because the belief had rested, in part, on the infallibility of the party. And if the party had been wrong, catastrophically, murderously wrong about Stalin, then what else had it been wrong about? The crack in the foundation, once visible, could not be made invisible again. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from maintaining a performance you no longer believe in. It is different from ordinary tiredness. You can sleep and recover from ordinary tiredness, but the exhaustion of sustained inauthenticity is something that accumulates over years, over decades, and it changes the person who carries it in ways that are difficult to name and more difficult to reverse. The generation that came of age in the Soviet Union in the 1960s and 1970s, the generation that would eventually dismantle the system, or watch it dismantle itself, was the first generation to grow up entirely within the architecture of the lie. They had not been there for the revolution. They had not felt the early heat of genuine belief. They had been born into a world where the official story was simply the air, present everywhere, unquestionable, slightly stale. And they developed, with remarkable ingenuity, the coping strategies that this world required. The central one was a kind of radical compartmentalization. You had an official self, the one that said the right things at work and at party meetings, that voted unanimously for the correct candidates, that expressed the correct opinions on the correct subjects. And you had a private self, the one that thought what it actually thought, that read the forbidden books passed from hand to hand in apartments at night, that listened to Voice of America on a shortwave radio with the sound turned low, that made the jokes, the endless devastating Soviet jokes, which were perhaps the most sophisticated philosophical tradition the Soviet Union produced. The jokes matter. They matter because they were not simply humor. They were a parallel discourse, a shadow language in which the truth that could not be said in public was said privately. The Soviet joke was a form of epistemological resistance, a way of knowing that what you were officially told was absurd without ever having to mount an explicit argument against it. They were a way, too, of community, of recognizing in the laughter of another person that they also knew that you were not alone in your knowing. There is a famous one that captures the essence of the whole system. A man goes to buy meat. There is no meat. He goes to buy bread. There is no bread. He goes to buy milk. There is no milk. He goes home and tells his wife, "This is terrible, there is nothing in the stores." His wife shrugs and says, "It's fine. The TV said there's plenty of everything." The joke is not subtle, but then the best truths rarely need to be. In 12 words, it names the central pathology of the late Soviet system, the absolute unembarrassed divergence between the official account and the visible reality. Have you ever lived inside an explanation of the world that you knew, privately, did not match what you could see? An explanation maintained by authority, or by social pressure, or simply by the accumulated weight of everyone around you pretending it was true. Most people, if they are honest, know something of this. In smaller ways, in more benign contexts. The sensation of saying something in a meeting that you do not quite believe. The experience of performing agreement you do not feel. It is, in its modest form, an ordinary feature of social life. In its extreme form, the form the Soviet state required, it becomes something else. It becomes, over decades, a kind of spiritual corrosion. The sociologist Alexei Yurchak, writing in his remarkable book about the late Soviet period, introduced a concept that captures this perfectly. He called it hypernormalization, the condition in which every institution in a society continues to perform its function, to hold its meetings, issue its reports, announce its achievements, celebrate its anniversaries, while everyone involved knows at some level that the performance has long since detached from any underlying reality, the form without the substance, the ritual without the belief. A vast, intricate machine still running, still producing its outputs, from which the animating purpose has gradually drained away. This was the Soviet Union in the 1970s, the decade that the Russians came to call the Zastoy, the stagnation. Leonid Brezhnev led the country from 1964 to 1982, and his leadership was, in many ways, the perfect expression of hypernormalization. He was not a visionary. He was not even, by the late years of his tenure, particularly functional. He suffered a series of strokes and was widely known to be, in a medical sense, barely present. And yet the machinery of the state continued to operate, continued to produce its communiques and its 5-year plans and its harvest figures and its military parades, because the machinery did not require a driver anymore. It had become self-perpetuating, not because anyone believed in it, but because stopping it was unimaginable. The economy tells the starkest version of this story. The Soviet Union had, in the post-war decades, achieved genuine industrial growth. It had built steel mills and power stations and weapons systems and a space program that humiliated the Americans in the early years of the space race. There were real achievements, but the model that had produced those achievements, the centralized command economy, in which production decisions were made not by markets but by bureaucratic fiat, had by the 1970s run into fundamental and unfixable problems. The central problem was information. A market economy is, among other things, an information system. Prices signal scarcity and abundance. They tell producers what to make and in what quantities. They tell consumers what is available and at what cost. They are imperfect. Markets fail in well-documented ways, but they generate and transmit an enormous amount of information about what people actually want, as distinct from what planners think they should want. The Soviet command economy had no equivalent mechanism. It had Gosplan, the central planning agency, staffed by thousands of economists producing millions of calculations about what the economy should produce. But Gosplan could not replicate what the market did automatically. It could not process the full complexity of a modern economy's needs. And so things were made that no one wanted, in quantities that bore little relation to demand, while things that were wanted were unavailable or scarce. The collective farm system, The collectivization that Stalin had imposed by terror in the early 1930s, destroying the private peasant agriculture that had fed Russia for centuries, was perhaps the most catastrophic example of this. Soviet agriculture, collectivized and politically managed, never achieved the yields of comparable economies. The Soviet Union, which before the revolution had been one of the world's great grain exporters, found itself by the 1970s importing grain from the United States and Canada to feed its population. The ideological humiliation of this was so acute that it was discussed, when it was discussed at all, in terms so oblique as to be essentially meaningless. But the humiliation was not the real problem. The real problem was that the failure of agriculture and the failure of the consumer economy more broadly meant that the promise of the revolution, the promise that communism would deliver material abundance and human flourishing, was visibly, undeniably, daily unfulfilled. The average Soviet citizen could see this every time they stood in a line for bread, every time a pair of shoes wore out and there were no replacements in the stores, every time they compared their living standard to what they glimpsed from Western television broadcasts and from the reports of those who had traveled of life in the capitalist West. And here is the thing that made this particular failure different from ordinary policy failure, ordinary economic difficulty. It could not be acknowledged. A government that had staked its claim to legitimacy on the promise that it was building a superior civilization, that communism would ultimately outperform capitalism in every dimension of human welfare, could not simply say, "We have been wrong. The system is not working. Here is how we intend to fix it." Because fixing it would have required acknowledging that it was broken. And acknowledging that it was broken would have required acknowledging that the story was not true. And the story was the state. The story was the source of legitimacy. Without the story, there was nothing. So instead, the gap was managed. The figures were adjusted. The harvests that had failed were reported as harvests that had modestly succeeded. The consumer goods that were unavailable were described as temporarily out of stock. The comparison to the West, which was becoming increasingly unfavorable on almost every metric, was managed through a combination of censorship and counter-narrative, stories about unemployment in America, about poverty in Britain, about the spiritual emptiness of capitalist consumerism. The reality was not changed. The account of reality was maintained. The machinery kept running, and the people knew. Not all of them, not all of the time, and not with the same clarity. Some people were more insulated from the evidence than others. Some were more invested in the story than others. Some had simply grown up inside the performance so thoroughly that the performance had become for them close to indistinguishable from truth. But enough people knew. The private ledgers were filling, the jokes were getting sharper, the gap between what was said and what was seen was widening, year by year, in a million small imperceptible increments, and the exhaustion of maintaining the performance was accumulating, without anyone quite naming it, towards something that nobody could predict and nobody was ready for. Mikhail Gorbachev was 54 years old when he became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in March 1985. He was, by the standards of the aging leadership that surrounded him, almost comically young and vigorous. His two immediate predecessors, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, had both been visibly, grievously ill when they came to power, and had both died within months of their appointment. The Soviet Union had developed a dark, unofficial tradition of watching its elderly leaders decline in public, their deterioration carefully managed by state media that showed footage of vigorous men while the real men were barely functional. Gorbachev was different. He was energetic. He was, in the Soviet context, articulate. He could speak in public without a prepared text, which was remarkable enough to be noted as a sign of distinction. He had grown up in the provinces in the North Caucasus, the son of peasants, and had experienced collectivization and the Second World War and the full reality of Soviet provincial life in ways that many of his colleagues in the Moscow elite had not. He had risen through the party apparatus in the conventional way, but he carried with him, by multiple accounts, a genuine if inchoate sense that things needed to change. What is crucial to understand about Gorbachev, and it is something that many accounts of the Soviet collapse either understate or miss entirely, is that he did not intend to destroy the Soviet Union. This is not revisionism. It is what he said at the time, repeatedly and forcefully, and what he maintained in the decades after. He believed, with what now reads as a kind of tragic faith, that the Soviet system was fundamentally sound but had been mismanaged, distorted, ossified. He believed it could be reformed. He believed that if you opened it up a little, if you allowed some honesty, some transparency, some genuine public debate, the system would repair itself. It would generate new energy, new legitimacy, new belief. He called his two major reforms glasnost and perestroika. The words are Russian, but they have become part of the global vocabulary because of what they unleashed. Glasnost meant openness, a relaxation of censorship, an encouragement of public honesty about the real state of things. Perestroika meant restructuring, an attempt to reform the economic and political institutions of the Soviet state to make them function more effectively. Both words sound, in English translation, relatively modest, and Gorbachev seems to have intended them to be relatively modest. He wanted to let some fresh air in. He did not understand, could not have understood, that what he was opening was not a window but a dam, because the force that had been building behind that dam for decades was enormous. The accumulated private knowledge, the years of jokes and whispers and kitchen conversations, the private ledgers of disbelief, all of it had been compressed and contained by the machinery of the Soviet state. By the very real risk of speaking certain truths in public, glasnost did not create that force. It simply removed one of the walls that had been holding it back. And what poured through was not a tidy reform of the system. It was the submerged reality of the Soviet Union, speaking for the first time at full volume. The newspapers began to publish things they had never published before. The magazines, Ogonyok, Novy Mir, Moscow News, began to run articles about the crimes of the Stalin period, about the real state of the economy, about corruption in the party apparatus. Readers lined up in the streets to buy these publications. The print runs were enormous. People read them with the concentrated hunger of people who have been deprived of honest speech for so long that honest speech has become a kind of intoxicant. The effect was extraordinary and, from the perspective of the Soviet state, entirely predictable in hindsight and entirely unanticipated at the time. When you tell people who have spent decades performing belief that it is now permissible to say what they actually think, they say what they actually think. And what they actually thought turned out to be, in many cases, devastatingly critical of the system. Not because they had been secretly plotting revolt, but because the private ledgers, the accumulated evidence of the gap between the story and the reality, had been filling for years, and now they could be spoken aloud. And then something happened that Gorbachev had even less ability to control. People stopped being afraid. Fear is one of the primary mechanisms by which authoritarian systems maintain themselves. The knowledge that speaking certain truths could get you arrested, fired, exiled, this knowledge, internalized over decades, shapes behavior in ways that are so pervasive they are difficult to fully see from inside them. The fear becomes part of the furniture. You stop noticing it the way you stop noticing the walls of the room you live in. It is simply there, shaping the space of the possible. But fear of this kind is not actually a constant. It is a function of probability and consequence. If the probability of being punished for speaking falls because the state's willingness or capacity to punish declines, and if the consequence of speaking seems, increasingly, to be that nothing happens, then the fear begins, slowly, to loosen. And once it loosens further, because people begin to see that other people are speaking and not being punished. And this itself changes the calculation. The philosopher Timothy Snyder has written about the importance of breaking the private-public barrier, the moment when people take the step from private knowledge to public speech. This step, in an authoritarian system, is the most dangerous one. It is the step that requires not just belief, but courage. But once enough people take it, simultaneously, the calculus shifts. You are no longer one person speaking against the state. You are part of something that suddenly feels, for the first time, like a majority. This is what happened in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. Not gradually, not in small increments, but with a sudden, shocking velocity that surprised almost everyone, including the people doing the speaking. The dam did not spring a small leak. It cracked, and the cracks spread faster than anyone could manage or predict or control. The specific events of those years read now with the compressed vividness of a dream. Chernobyl in April 1986 turned out to be not just a nuclear disaster, but a metaphorical one, a moment when the incompetence and the denial and the official lying that the Soviet system had normalized were suddenly graphically, catastrophically visible. The authorities' first instinct was to manage the information, as they had managed information about every previous disaster. But Chernobyl was too big, too visible, too present in the immediate environment of the people living near it. The wind carried the radiation. The radiation did not care about official statements. For the first time in the memory of most citizens, There was a crisis in which the gap between the official story and the physical reality was not a matter of interpretation or ideology, but a matter of measurable particles in the air. You could die from the gap, and then the nationalities question opened. This was perhaps the most unpredictable development of the Gorbachev period, and in retrospect, the most decisive. The Soviet Union was not, despite its name, a single nation. It was an empire, the inheritor of the Russian imperial project, containing over 100 distinct national and ethnic groups, many of which had been absorbed into the Russian state by conquest and had maintained, beneath the surface of Soviet nationality policy, their own languages, their own histories, their own grievances. The Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania had been independent states before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact delivered them to Stalin in 1940. They had not forgotten this. Georgia, Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, all of them carried histories that did not fit comfortably inside the official Soviet narrative of voluntary union and fraternal cooperation. Glasnost did not create these grievances. It created the conditions in which they could be spoken. And once spoken, they proved to be vastly more powerful than Gorbachev had imagined, or than anyone in the central government had planned for. The Baltic states began agitating for independence. The Caucasus erupted in ethnic conflict. Ukraine, the second largest Soviet republic and the breadbasket of the Union, began to develop a political identity that was not simply Soviet. The centrifugal forces that had been contained by the weight of the state began to pull outward with a force that the state, already weakened, could not resist. There is a moment, somewhere in the late 1980s, that Gorbachev must have felt the thing he had set in motion and understood that he could not stop it. He must have seen the distance between his intention and the outcome growing wider with every week. He had wanted to save the Soviet Union. He was watching it come apart in his hands. The reformer who believes he can control the pace of transformation is one of the most tragic figures in political history, not because his intentions are bad, but because the forces he unleashes do not share his timetable and do not respond to his appeals for moderation. The window he opened was not a window, it was the entire wall. There is something that happens to a society when the story it has been telling about itself collapses. It is not simply relief. It is not simply liberation. It is something more disorienting and more painful than either of those things, a kind of vertigo that comes from realizing that the coordinates by which you have been navigating were not quite right, and that you must now orient yourself in a landscape without a map. The people of the Soviet Union, particularly those in Russia itself, but across the republics too, had been living inside an identity. The Soviet identity was whatever else it was, a coherent narrative, a story about where history had come from, where it was going, what it meant to be human, what the purpose of collective effort was, what sacrifices were worth making and why. It was not a gentle story. It was not a comfortable story. But it was a story that gave things meaning. That told people that what they were doing, the work, the sacrifice, the submission to collective demands, had a purpose larger than individual benefit. When that story began to disintegrate, what replaced it was not immediately another story. What replaced it was a kind of silence, a vacuum. And into that vacuum rushed things. Nationalism, yes, and liberalism, and market economics, and religion, and organized crime, and 1,000 other competing narratives, none of which had the weight or the reach of the thing that had collapsed. The late Soviet period and the immediate post-Soviet period were characterized, above all, by a peculiar and acute disorientation. Even people who had privately known the Soviet story was false found that its public collapse produced not just relief, but something more complicated: grief and uncertainty, and an often paralyzing absence of direction. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz and spent his career thinking about the question of meaning, wrote that human beings can endure almost any suffering if they have a reason for it. A story that makes the suffering legible, that gives it direction, that connects it to something larger. What is unbearable is not suffering, but meaningless suffering. Suffering without a story. The Soviet collapse, for millions of people, was precisely this: the removal of the story that had made their suffering meaningful. They had sacrificed, and worked, and submitted, and endured, and now they were told that it had been for nothing. Or not for nothing, but for something that was wrong, or fraudulent, or smaller and uglier than they had been led to believe. The psychological toll of this is difficult to overstate and largely unacknowledged in the Western accounts of the Soviet collapse, which tend to read the events of 1989 to 1991 as straightforwardly liberating. There was liberation, yes, but there was also devastation. Suicide rates in Russia rose sharply in the 1990s. Life expectancy fell dramatically, particularly for men. Alcoholism, which had been a chronic problem in the Soviet period, worsened. The social structures that had provided stability and identity, the enterprise, the collective, the party organization, the neighborhood committee, dissolved and nothing immediately replaced them. This is not an argument for the Soviet system. The Soviet system was, in fundamental ways, a catastrophe of human freedom and human flourishing that created misery on an enormous scale for most of the century of its existence. The people who suffered under it and who survived to see its end were right to celebrate, but the celebration and the devastation were not mutually exclusive. They coexisted in the minds and bodies of real people in ways that are not easily resolved and that a simple narrative of liberation tends to flatten. What does it mean to live through the collapse of the world, you know? Not just the political world, the government, the institutions, the economy, but the deeper world, the world of meaning, of identity, of the story that tells you who you are and why it matters. This is a question that extends well beyond the Soviet Union. Every era of radical transformation produces this experience in some form. The person who discovers that the religion they were raised in is not true, the person who realizes that the ideology they committed to was wrong, the person who finds that the story they told about themselves, their marriage, their career, their purpose, has lost its coherence. The philosopher Peter Berger called it the collapse of the plausibility structure, the social and institutional framework that makes a particular way of understanding the world feel natural and inevitable. When the plausibility structure collapses, the beliefs it supported do not simply vanish. They hang in the air, unmoored, for a period that can be longer and more painful than the collapse itself. The work of rebuilding meaning is not fast, it is not clean, and it cannot be done on a government schedule. The Soviet citizens who had spent decades maintaining the performance of belief, the greengrocers signed the unanimous vote, the applause at the correct moments, did not suddenly, with the arrival of glasnost or the dissolution of the Union, have access to a clear, authentic sense of who they were beneath the performance, because the performance, maintained for long enough, becomes part of the self. The border between the mask and the face grows unclear. You cannot simply take the mask off and find the original face waiting underneath, unchanged. The face has been shaped by the mask. It carries its contours. This is the deepest damage that the Soviet system did, deeper than the economic damage, deeper than the political damage. It created, across several generations, a condition of endemic inauthenticity, a habituated inability to distinguish between genuine belief and performed belief, a trained reflex of saying what was safe rather than what was true. And when the constraint that had made this necessary was removed, what was left was not a suddenly liberated population of clear-eyed truth-tellers. What was left was a population that had lost the habit of truth-telling, and that would need time, far more time than the political transition provided, to develop it again. The Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin, writing in a different context entirely about the nature of the novel, said that authentic speech is speech in which the speaker takes full responsibility for what is said. Speech in which the speaker means it. The opposite of authentic speech is not lying, exactly, it is something subtler. Speech that is evacuated of genuine intention, that functions as social performance rather than genuine communication. Bakhtin called this the word of the other, speech that has lost its first-person quality, that is spoken not because the speaker believes it, but because the social situation demands it. The Soviet Union produced, as one of its primary outputs, a culture saturated with the word of the other. A culture in which genuine first-person speech had become, for large portions of the population, genuinely difficult to access. The August coup of 1991, the attempt by a group of hardline communist officials to remove Gorbachev from power and reverse the reforms, failed not primarily because of the heroism of the people who stood in front of tanks outside the Russian White House. Though that heroism was real, it failed primarily because almost no one was willing to fight for the system. The soldiers sent to enforce the coup largely stayed in their barracks or defected. The party officials who might have supported it looked at their phones and discovered that the networks they relied on were not functioning. The KGB operatives who were supposed to arrest key figures simply did not. There was, at the moment when the system needed to be defended, an almost universal reluctance to defend it. Not because everyone had become a revolutionary, but because the performance of belief had finally, decisively run out of performers. The Soviet Union formally dissolved on December 25, 1991. Mikhail Gorbachev gave a short speech and resigned. The red flag above the Kremlin was lowered and replaced with the tricolor of Russia. The 15 Soviet republics became 15 independent states. The most powerful ideological project of the 20th century ceased to exist without a final battle, without a surrender document, in the quiet, slightly anticlimactic way that enormous things sometimes end, not with an explosion but with a silence. And then the distant sound of something releasing, and then the strange, open, terrifying, necessary quiet of what comes after. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was announced as a triumph of liberal democracy and the free market. It was experienced by much of the world's media and many of its political leaders as the final verdict of history, the proof that one system had won and another had lost, that the arc of time bent toward freedom and markets and individual rights, and that the question of which way to organize a society had been definitively finally answered. Francis Fukuyama called it the end of history, not in a trivial sense, not the claim that things would stop happening, but in the deeper sense that the great ideological contest of modernity had been resolved, that the direction of human progress was now clear and unambiguous, and that what remained was essentially administrative. This turned out to be wrong in ways that are almost uncomfortable to contemplate, given how much confidence accompanied the claim. History did not end. The ideological contests did not resolve. The liberal democratic order that seemed in 1991 to be the obvious inheritor of the Soviet collapse found itself within 3 decades, facing challenges not from a revived communism but from something more diffuse and more difficult to name, from authoritarian nationalism, from populist revolts against the institutions that liberalism had built, from a growing and widespread sense that the promises of the post-Cold War settlement had not for large portions of the world's population been kept. And this brings us back to the question that opened this story, the question about what happens when a story loses its credibility. Because the story of liberal capitalism, in its triumphalist post-1991 form, made its own promises. It promised that free markets would deliver prosperity, that democracy would deliver justice, that the end of ideological constraint would release human potential in ways that would be broadly and relatively quickly felt. And those promises were, for a significant portion of the global population, not fulfilled, or fulfilled in ways that were so unequal, so concentrated in certain hands and in certain places that the majority of the people who were supposed to be its beneficiaries found themselves asking in their private ledgers whether the story was quite what they had been told. This is not an argument for equivalence. The failure of liberal democracy to live up to all of its promises is not the same as the failure of Soviet communism to live up to all of its promises. The scales of coercion and suffering are not comparable. The structural violence of a poorly functioning democracy is not the same as the structural violence of the Gulag. These distinctions matter. And yet, there is something worth looking at in the parallel. Something worth sitting with in the observation that the pattern of a story being told about a system, a story that does not fully match the lived experience of many people inside that system, and the growing gap between the promise and the reality quietly filling up private ledgers of disbelief, this pattern is not unique to Soviet communism. It is something that human societies generate with unfortunate regularity under a variety of ideological arrangements. The Soviet collapse teaches something about the nature of legitimacy that is not time-bound or ideology-bound. It teaches that no system sustains itself by force alone, that force without legitimacy is enormously expensive to maintain, and ultimately unsustainable. That legitimacy is not granted once and retained forever, but must be continuously earned, renewed, revised, brought into some reasonable correspondence with the actual conditions of people's lives. That when the gap between the story and the reality grows too wide, and when the effort required to maintain the performance of belief becomes too great, and when the fear that has been holding the performance in place begins to loosen, the collapse, when it comes, can come with a suddenness that surprises everyone, including the people who thought they understood the system from the inside. The Soviet leaders of the Brezhnev era knew their system was failing. They were not stupid. The economists knew. The party officials knew. The intelligence services knew and reported what they knew, and the reports were filed, and the situation was monitored, and the 5-year plans continued to be announced, and the harvests continued to be reported as successful, and the standard of living continued to be described as improving, because the alternative, saying publicly what was known privately, would have required dismantling the story that was the only remaining source of the system's claim to legitimacy. And so the gap was maintained. The performance continued until it couldn't. This is the lesson that is hardest to learn because it is the one most costly to acknowledge. It is easier and more common and more human to maintain a story whose credibility is declining than to say, "This story is no longer true, we need a different one." The revision of a story, particularly a story on which a great deal of identity and power has been staked, is not a cognitive event. It is a loss. It involves grief. It involves the disorientation of navigating without familiar landmarks. It involves the humility of admitting that what you said before was wrong or partial, or more complicated than you understood. Gorbachev tried to revise the story and found that revision at that scale, in that context, was not a controlled operation. The dissident Andrei Sakharov, who spent years in internal exile for his criticism of the Soviet system and who lived to see the glasnost period, spoke shortly before his death in 1989 about the difference between reform and genuine transformation. He said something like, "The point is not to improve the system. The point is to change the fundamental relationship between the individual and the state, to move from a system in which the state grants rights to a system in which the individual possesses them inherently." Gorbachev wanted the former. What came was, in some messy and incomplete way, a version of the latter, and Sakharov, who had suffered for the truth more than almost anyone, died still uncertain about whether it would hold. His uncertainty, in retrospect, looks like wisdom. 30 years after the dissolution, the question of what to make of the Soviet Union has become more complicated, not less. The passage of time, the accumulation of evidence, the opening of archives, the testimonies of people who lived through it and have had decades to reflect, all of this has produced a picture that is harder to compress into simple verdicts than the immediate post-1991 consensus suggested. There are people, millions of people in Russia and across the former Soviet republics, who remember the Soviet period with something that functions like nostalgia. This nostalgia is often dismissed in Western commentary as simply wrong, or as evidence of authoritarian psychology, or as the predictable consequence of economic disappointment in the post-Soviet years. And those dismissals contain some truth. The nostalgia is often selective. It tends to smooth over the terror, the deprivation, the surveillance, the pervasive unfreedom. It is frequently a nostalgia not for what the Soviet Union actually was, but for a particular quality of the experience of living in it. A quality of stability, of community, of shared purpose, however hollow that the chaotic post-Soviet transition did not provide. But to dismiss the nostalgia entirely is to miss what it is pointing at. It is pointing at the fact that human beings need, as a basic psychological condition, more than freedom. They need belonging. They need purpose. They need a sense that the life they are living has a direction and a meaning that extends beyond their individual circumstances. The Soviet system failed, catastrophically, at providing most of the things that a good society should provide. But it provided, or appeared to provide, certain things in this register of meaning and community that the market economy that succeeded it did not automatically replace. And the absence of those things in people's lives produces a grief that has no obvious political address. The historian Sheila Fitzpatrick, who has spent decades studying Soviet social history, has written about what she calls the ordinary experience of the Soviet Union, the experience not of the dissidents and the intellectuals and the Gulag survivors, whose stories dominate the Western narrative, but of the ordinary citizen who navigated the system as best they could, who found within its constraints a life that was recognizably human. That contained friendships and love affairs and family dinners and private ambitions and small victories. She is not arguing that this ordinary experience justifies the system. She is arguing that the system produced human lives, not just human suffering, and that the full picture requires both. This is uncomfortable for the triumphalist narrative. It is uncomfortable because the triumphalist narrative needs the Soviet Union to have been simply a machine of oppression, a machine that was, when it finally ended, simply ended, leaving its survivors to gratefully embrace the freedom that replaced it. The messier truth is that the Soviet Union, like all very large and very old systems, was also a culture, a set of habits and relationships and meanings, and that its collapse left behind not just liberated individuals, but individuals who had to rebuild from whatever materials were available the architecture of a meaningful life. And here is the more uncomfortable question still: what was rebuilt in its place? The Russia that emerged from the Soviet collapse is not a liberal democracy. It is something harder to categorize, a state that maintains the forms of democratic process while systematically undermining its substance, that uses the language of sovereignty and anti-imperialism to justify what is functionally a new authoritarianism, that has invested enormous energy in constructing a new story about Russian greatness and Western hostility and the uniqueness of the Russian path. The story has changed. The gap between the story and the reality has not. Vladimir Putin came to power in 1999, less than a decade after the Soviet dissolution, and his rise was in significant ways a product of the very conditions that the collapse had created: the economic chaos, the political fragmentation. The sense of national humiliation, the yearning for a strong story to replace the one that had collapsed. He offered, in place of the communist story, a different story, of Russian civilization, of great power status, of stability and order after the disorder of the 1990s. It was a story that spoke directly to the grief and disorientation that the collapse had produced, and it was received, at least initially, with genuine relief by large parts of the population. This is not a simple story of continuity. The Soviet Union did not seamlessly become the Russian Federation, and the differences matter, but the persistence of certain patterns is worth noting. The gap between official speech and private speech. The cultivation of what the scholars call performative loyalty, the display of support for a leader and a system that may or may not correspond to genuine belief. The management of information. The construction of a state-sponsored narrative that must be not quite believed but consistently performed. These patterns did not end in 1991. They were, in important ways, the inheritance, the institutional and psychological inheritance, of the Soviet century. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, writing about totalitarianism in 1951, made an observation that has aged with extraordinary accuracy. She said that the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but the person for whom the distinction between fact and fiction has become meaningless. Not the fanatical believer, but the cynical one. The person who does not believe anything in particular, who holds no fixed convictions, who regards the official story as one more piece of noise in a world saturated with competing claims. Because such a person is, paradoxically, the most manipulable of all. They are not deceived by the propaganda because they take it seriously. They are shaped by it precisely because they don't, because the absence of conviction leaves them with no ground from which to resist. The late Soviet period produced exactly this kind of subject in large numbers. The cynicism that was the psychological product of decades of institutionalized lying. The exhaustion of the ideological apparatus had destroyed not just faith in communism, but for many people, faith itself, the capacity for genuine belief in anything. And this cynicism, this habituated skepticism toward all claims and all stories, was not a foundation on which a healthy democracy could easily be built. Democracy requires, among other things, that citizens take seriously the possibility that some claims are true and others are false, that some arguments are better than others, that the effort of distinguishing between them matters. Cynicism, in its extreme form, is the enemy of this. It produces not independent thinking but detachment, not vigilance but passivity, not citizens who hold power to account, but audiences who consume politics as spectacle. This is the inheritance that the Soviet Union left, not just in Russia, but in the political cultures of all the states that emerged from it. The deep skepticism, the reflexive distrust of institutions, the trained ability to say one thing and mean another, the difficulty of imagining genuine political agency. These are not permanent features of any culture. They can change, and are changing in different directions in different places, but they are real, and they are rooted in the particular experience of living for 70 years in the architecture of the lie. One of the strangest things about studying the Soviet collapse is the quality of surprise that accompanied it, not just the surprise of outside observers, which might be understandable given the information constraints of the Cold War, but the surprise of the people inside it. The Soviet experts in Western intelligence services, the academic Sovietologists, the journalists who had covered the country for decades, but also, and more remarkably, the people who ran the system. The party officials who woke up in the autumn of 1991 and discovered, with something close to disbelief, that what they had been managing was gone. The political scientist Randall Collins, writing in the 1990s, argued that the Soviet collapse was a classic case of what he called the micro-sociology of regime fragility. His argument was roughly that the apparent solidity of authoritarian regimes is largely a product of the rituals that maintain them, the parades, the unanimous votes, the public performances of loyalty, and that the collapse of those rituals can be extremely rapid once it begins, because each person's willingness to perform is partly a function of their perception that others are also performing. When the performance begins to look thin, when people start to see that others are no longer fully committed to the ritual, the perception shifts, rapidly, non-linearly, and what had looked solid begins to look hollow, and then it is hollow. This is a sobering observation because it suggests that the apparent strength of authoritarian systems is, to a significant degree, an illusion maintained by the participants themselves. The Soviet Union in 1985 appeared, to most observers, to most of its own citizens, to be stable, enduring, perhaps imperfect but certainly durable. 6 years later it was gone, not because a catastrophic external force had struck it, not because a revolution had swept it away, because the performances that maintained its apparent solidity had stopped being performed, and its actual condition, the hollow interior, the drained legitimacy, the empty rituals, had become visible. There is a Russian word pokazuka that the Soviet citizens used for things done purely for show, a factory that ran at full capacity only on the days inspectors were expected, a collective farm that suddenly produced impressive yields in time for the Agricultural Commission's visit, a neighborhood committee that assembled in full attendance for the party officials' inspection and otherwise barely existed. It is a beautiful word because it names something precise, the performance of function in the absence of function, the appearance without the substance. The Soviet economy was, in its late period, significantly pokazuka. The official figures showed growth. The reality was stagnation and decline. The official reports described a system operating at full capacity. The reality was a system running on inertia, on the institutional memory of genuine effort that had largely dissipated, on the threat of consequences for failure that had itself become increasingly hollow. And this pokazuka was not a secret. Almost everyone involved in the system knew it was happening, but knowing it and being able to do anything about it were different things. The system had a remarkable capacity for self-perpetuation in the face of its own failure, not because anyone believed in it, because changing it would have required a clarity about what was wrong and a willingness to accept the consequences of honesty that the system had spent decades making practically unthinkable. And so the pokazuka continued, year after year, report after report, inspection after inspection, and the gap between the performance and the reality widened, and the work of maintaining the performance became heavier, and the exhaustion accumulated, until Gorbachev opened the window, until the dam cracked, until the performances stopped and the emptiness inside became visible to everyone at once, and the word went around in the way that only truly important words travel, fast and sideways and through every channel simultaneously, that this thing that had seemed immovable was in fact already gone, that what everyone had thought was a wall was a painted screen, that the empire that had shaped the 20th century had been, for some years, a stage set without a play. There is something vertiginous about this recognition, something that produces, if you sit with it, a quiet but persistent unease about the nature of solidity in general, about how much of what seems fixed and durable in the world we inhabit is, in fact, maintained by collective performance, about how quickly the apparent can become the actual and the actual can become the apparent, about the thinness of the membrane between an ordered world and the chaos that exists on its other side. The Soviet Union was the largest, most thoroughly documented, most carefully studied example of this phenomenon in the 20th century. But it is not the only one. Regimes, institutions, marriages, careers, friendships, belief systems, all of them are, in some part, maintained by the daily performance of people who have not yet stopped, and all of them are vulnerable to the moment when the performance falters, when enough people simultaneously decide that the energy required to maintain it is no longer worth spending, when the private ledger, finally, tips. Behind every large historical event there are faces, and the faces of the Soviet collapse are worth looking at for a moment, not as symbols or representatives of larger forces, but as people. People who were trying to do something, who understood some things and misunderstood others, who carried the weight of what was happening in ways that changed them permanently. Mikhail Gorbachev died in August 2022, at the age of 91. He died in a Russia that had invaded Ukraine 6 months earlier, under a leader who regarded the dissolution of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He died with his reforms widely blamed by Russian nationalists and by Western critics alike, though for opposite reasons, for the chaos that followed the collapse. In Russia, his name had become, for many people, synonymous with weakness, with naive idealism, with the failure to protect what Russia had built. In the West, he was regarded more kindly but still as a transitional figure, important for what he allowed to end, but not for what he created. What is less often acknowledged is the genuine courage of what Gorbachev attempted. He was a man who had risen through the Soviet system, who had internalized its values and its self-understanding, who was in every institutional sense a product of the thing he was trying to reform. And he stood up in front of that system and said, In effect, we have been lying, and we need to stop. The lies were not his invention. He did not create the culture of Pokazuka, but he decided at some personal cost and at enormous political risk to try to end it. The consequences exceeded his intentions and his control, but the intention was real, and the courage was real, and dismissing him as simply naive does not do justice to the difficulty of what he faced. Boris Yeltsin is a stranger figure, more dramatic, more flawed, more difficult to read. He had the actor's instinct that Gorbachev lacked, the ability to read a crowd, to find the gesture that the moment required, to stand on the tank and speak the words that needed to be spoken. And he did stand on the tank in August 1991 during the attempted coup, and the image of him standing there, defiant, slightly improbable, undeniably brave in that specific moment, became one of the defining images of the entire post-Soviet transition. But Yeltsin was also the man who presided over the catastrophic economic reforms of the 1990s, the man who handed Russia over to the oligarchs, the man who was by his second term visibly compromised by alcohol and ill health, and who made in his final weeks in power a choice that would define the next quarter century of Russian history: the appointment of Vladimir Putin as his successor. What did Yeltsin understand about Putin in those final weeks of 1999? What did he think he was building? He wanted, by most accounts, a guarantee of personal safety for himself and his family, a successor who would not pursue him for the crimes and the failures of his tenure. He wanted someone strong enough to stabilize the country, which was genuinely in crisis. He may have believed with the optimism of a man who did not think very clearly about the institutional conditions of democracy, that the democratic structures of the Russian state were robust enough to survive the appointment of an authoritarian leader, that the system would constrain the man. The system did not constrain the man. Andrei Sakharov, physicist, dissident, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, represents something different from both Gorbachev and Yeltsin. He represents the figure of the person who simply refused, who looked at the gap between the story and the reality and said, "I will not maintain this gap." Not for personal advantage, not for institutional security, not even for pragmatic reasons of incremental change. Just, I will not. His father was a physics professor, his mother was a teacher, and he was born into the Soviet intelligentsia in 1921, the year the revolution was 4 years old. He grew up entirely within the Soviet world. He helped build the Soviet hydrogen bomb. And then, from somewhere within himself, from some resource that the Soviet system had not quite managed to colonize, he developed the capacity to speak the truth at a cost that most people reasonably were not willing to pay. He was exiled to the closed city of Gorky in 1980 for his criticism of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. He lived there, monitored by the KGB, unable to practice science, cut off from his colleagues and his country for 7 years. And he continued to write. The letters that came out of Gorky, smuggled out, published in Samizdat and in Western newspapers, were not the letters of a bitter man or a broken one. They were the letters of someone who had found, in the act of refusing to perform the lie, something that functioned as a kind of freedom. Not comfort, not safety, but freedom in the deeper sense, freedom from the self-betrayal, the corruption of the interior that the performance required. He was released in 1986, under Gorbachev, and came back to Moscow to find a world that was, astonishingly, beginning to change. He gave speeches. He was elected to the new Congress of People's Deputies. He became, briefly, a figure in the chaotic, exhilarating, terrifying process of political transformation that Glasnost had set in motion. He died on the 14th of December 1989, 15 months before the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union. In circumstances that remain slightly mysterious, his heart simply stopped. He had been working the evening before. What does it mean that Sakharov did not live to see the end? There is something about his absence from the aftermath, from the chaos and the disappointments and the compromises of the transition, that carries a quality of narrative neatness that real lives rarely have. He was the man who had insisted, against all the pressure of the system and all the rationalization of cautious colleagues, that the truth mattered, that it was worth something even when it cost everything. He held that position, at personal cost, for decades. And then he died before the truth had fully proven itself, or failed to prove itself, or shown itself to be as complicated and ambiguous as truths generally are when they finally arrive in the world. He did not get to see what came after. Perhaps that is, in its strange way, a mercy. The Soviet Union dissolved into 15 countries. It left behind an enormous physical and cultural inheritance, nuclear weapons, industrial infrastructure, scientific institutions, an extraordinary tradition of literature and music and art, and an equally extraordinary tradition of surveillance and control. It left behind the habits of thought and the psychological formations that 7 decades of a particular kind of organized society produce in the people who live through it. And it left behind, this is perhaps the strangest and most persistent legacy, a set of unresolved questions about itself, about what it was and what it meant, that are still being argued over and that have taken on in recent years a renewed and urgent political significance. Because the story of the Soviet Union did not end in 1991. The Soviet Union ended. The story continued. In Russia, the story has been actively managed, revised, selectively remembered, instrumentalized by the successive governments that followed the collapse. The trauma and humiliation of the 1990s became the foundation for a new national narrative of recovery and reassertion. The Soviet period, which the Gorbachev and early Yeltsin years had briefly allowed to be examined with something like honesty, was gradually rehabilitated, not as a system to be restored exactly, but as a source of national pride. A time of great achievements and great sacrifices that deserved respect rather than condemnation. Stalin in particular became a complicated figure. Survey after survey through the 2000s and 2010s showed a substantial proportion of Russian citizens rating Stalin positively, not a majority, but enough to be striking. The rehabilitation was not total and was not uncontested. But it was real. It suggested that for a significant number of people, the desire for a story of national greatness, for a narrative in which Russia was not the perpetrator of crimes but the heroic builder of an industrial civilization and the victor over fascism, was more powerful than the desire to reckon fully with what that greatness had cost. This is a human thing, not a specifically Russian thing. Every nation manages its relationship to its own past through a process of selection and emphasis that tends to favor the stories that generate pride over the stories that generate shame. The difference, perhaps, in the Russian case is the scale and the recency of the crimes being managed and the degree to which the political system requires, for its legitimacy, a particular version of the past. Reckoning honestly with what the Soviet Union was, with the scope of the terror, the scale of the lies, the depth of the damage to 3 generations of people, would require a kind of public truth-telling that the current political arrangements in Russia make structurally very difficult. And so the patterns persist. Not identically, the specific content is different. The specific mechanisms are different, but the architecture is familiar. The gap between the official account and the lived reality. The private ledgers filling quietly in kitchens and apartments. The jokes, Russian political humor, always one of the most precise instruments of social observation, has not declined in quality. The performance of loyalty without genuine conviction, the management of information, the careful distance between what can be said and what cannot. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote that we only really possess those things we can give away. In the realm of the spirit, in the realm of genuine conviction and genuine thought, this means that we only really believe what we could, if circumstances required, acknowledge publicly. The thing we hold only in private, that we perform in public while believing privately, is not truly ours. It is a kind of tenant, occupying space in us without belonging to us. The Soviet project created, in its millions of subjects, a vast population of people carrying tenets, carrying beliefs and loyalties and identities that they had not truly chosen and did not truly own. And the collapse of the system, when it came, revealed the tenets for what they were, performances, empty of the belief that alone would have given them weight. What filled the space afterward, what, in the absence of the performed belief, people found to genuinely hold, that is perhaps the most important and least answered question of the Soviet legacy. In some places, and for some people, genuine things moved in. Genuine conviction about freedom, genuine commitment to democratic process, genuine moral seriousness about the crimes of the past and what reckoning with them required. In other places and for other people, the space remained largely empty, filled with cynicism or with nationalist substitute, or with the particular and dangerous combination of the two that produces a kind of passionate performance that looks like genuine belief but has the texture of its opposite. The Soviet Union is gone, but its lesson remains. It is a lesson about the fragility of systems that require their subjects to maintain a performance they have ceased to believe, about the slow, invisible, unstoppable accumulation of private disbelief, about the moment when the performance falters and the reality inside becomes visible, about the vertigo that follows, and the long, patient, imperfect work of building something genuine in the space where the performance used to be. History does not end. It deepens. It returns, wearing different clothes, speaking different languages, but circling the same essential questions. The same questions about what holds a society together and what happens when what holds it together is no longer quite believed. The same questions about the relationship between the stories we tell and the lives we actually live, about what we owe each other in truth, about the cost of the performance and the strange, difficult, necessary freedom of laying it down. There is a conversation that has been quietly taking place across the former Soviet world for 3 decades now, not in government buildings or academic conferences, but in apartments and kitchens and long phone calls, and the kind of conversations that begin after midnight when people finally say what they mean. It is a conversation about inheritance, about what it means to have been shaped by a system you did not choose, to carry in your psychology and your habits and your reflexes the imprint of something that is now officially gone. The writer Svetlana Alexievich, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2015, and whose work amounts to perhaps the most comprehensive oral history of the Soviet experience ever assembled, has been conducting versions of this conversation for decades. She records voices. She sits in rooms with ordinary people, women who survived the war, men who cleaned up Chernobyl, children who grew up in the Soviet period, and adults who grew up after it, and she listens. What she has found in thousands of hours of recorded testimony is something more complicated than either the triumphalist narrative or the nostalgic one. She has found a population of people who are, in many cases, still in the process of understanding what happened to them, who are still, 3 decades after the formal end of the system, trying to work out the relationship between who they were told to be and who they actually are. This is not a comfortable finding. It does not lend itself to clean political conclusions. It suggests that the effects of a system that penetrates deeply enough into private life and private thought are not resolved by the political end of that system, that the psychological formation it produces outlasts it, that the people who carry it require not just political freedom, the removal of the external constraint, but something more intimate and more difficult. The slow, often painful work of distinguishing inside themselves between the genuine and the performed, the truly held and the merely habitual. Alexievich herself, who was born in the Soviet Union and grew up there and remained in the post-Soviet Belarus of Alexander Lukashenko, has spoken about her own version of this work, about the difficulty, even for a person of her unusual clarity and moral seriousness, of fully understanding the degree to which her own interior life had been shaped by the system she was documenting, about the moments of surprise when she found unexpectedly a Soviet reflex in herself, a moment of performed loyalty, a moment of saying the safe thing rather than the true thing, a moment of the trained obliqueness that the system had made habitual in everyone who lived through it. She was forced into exile after the disputed 2020 presidential election in Belarus, when the post-Soviet authoritarian order that had been building for decades showed its face more clearly than usual. She is in her mid-70s now, still writing, still recording voices. What does it mean to inherit a psychology that was not chosen? Every generation inherits from the conditions that shaped their parents and grandparents a set of defaults, emotional reflexes, ways of reading the world, patterns of trust and distrust that were formed in response to conditions that may no longer apply. The children of the Depression develop certain relationships to scarcity that persist long after the scarcity is over. The children of war develop certain relationships to safety and danger that shape their behavior in circumstances of relative peace. These inheritances are not destiny. They can be examined and, with effort and intention, modified. But they must first be seen. And seeing them requires a kind of honesty about the conditions that produce them that is not always comfortable or easy. The post-Soviet inheritance is this: a culture that learned over 70 years to distrust official speech, that developed extraordinary sophistication in reading between the lines and decoding what was not said, in detecting the gap between the performed and the real, that maintained in private an intelligence and a richness of genuine thought that the public sphere rarely permitted, but that also developed alongside these virtues a reflexive cynicism, habitual distrust not just of authority, but of the possibility of genuine collective action, a trained inability to believe that public life could be something other than performance, that political participation could produce real change, that institutions could be genuinely rather than only performatively committed to the values they claimed. This cynicism, which is in one sense a rational response to a particular history, can be, in a different context, a form of paralysis. It produces a population that is very good at seeing through lies, but that struggles to build the alternative, that knows, with extraordinary precision, what is wrong but has difficulty imagining, and still more difficulty committing to, what might be right. That has been so thoroughly trained in the posture of disengagement, in the performance of not being naive, that genuine engagement, genuine investment in the possibility of collective life can feel like a kind of vulnerability it cannot afford. This is not peculiarly Russian. It is not unique to the post-Soviet condition. It is something that any sufficiently long experience of institutional dishonesty produces in any culture. The cynicism that a generation raised on political disappointment develops, the weary intelligence of the person who has been told too many things that weren't true, the exhaustion of the idealist who has learned, finally, to stop being an idealist. These are human conditions. The Soviet experience simply produced them in a particularly concentrated and well-documented form. But the question of what you do with this inheritance, how you carry it without being entirely shaped by it, how you maintain the hard-won skepticism without surrendering to the paralysis it can produce, that question is not only for the post-Soviet world, it is, in various forms, the question of our moment, of a world that has been through enough institutional failure, enough gap between official speech and lived reality, enough disappointment of large promises, to have developed, across many different cultures and political contexts, a version of the Soviet weariness, a version of the private ledger, a version of the exhaustion that comes from the performance of a belief you are no longer sure you hold. The Soviet Union is a warning, but it is not only a historical warning. It is a warning about the nature of systems that require too much of their subjects in the way of performance, about what happens when the gap between the public and the private becomes too wide, about the cost, to the individuals inside and to the system they compose, of the lived lie. And it is, perhaps, an invitation to attend more carefully to the private ledger, to notice when the gap between what we say and what we see, what we perform and what we actually believe, is widening. Not because such gaps are always catastrophic or always preventable, but because attending to them is, in some fundamental sense, the work of integrity, personal integrity, and the broader integrity of the societies we build and inhabit together. It is December 1991. The red flag is being lowered from the Kremlin. Outside, it is cold in the particular way Moscow is cold in December, not dramatically cold, but the kind of cold that settles into everything, that makes the air heavy with it, that muffles sound so that even the city sounds quieter than usual. There are cameras from around the world pointed at the flag. There are journalists preparing their broadcasts. History, as they say, is being made. But in an apartment somewhere in the city, in one of the identical residential blocks that extend in every direction from the Kremlin, that house, the millions of people who have been living through this not as history, but as their actual lives, someone is watching a small television. An older woman, maybe? She grew up in the Soviet Union. She lost people to the war and perhaps to the purges. She worked for 30 years in a factory or an office or a school. She raised children who grew up in the Soviet Union and who are now trying to understand what it means to live in something else. She watches the flag come down. What does she feel? This is the question that the news reports and the history books are not good at answering. The question that Alexievich has spent 30 years trying to approach from different directions without quite arriving at. Because what she feels is not simple. It is not simply relief, though there is relief. It is not simply grief, though there is grief. It is not simply the vertigo of the landmark disappearing, though there is that too. It is something more like the experience of waking from a very long dream. Not a pleasant dream necessarily, and not a nightmare exactly, but a dream that had a logic and a coherence, and a set of rules that felt, while you were in it, like the rules of reality. And now you are awake, and the logic is gone, and the coherence is gone, and what is left is the apartment, real, present, concrete, and the question of what to do in it now today. In the new morning that has arrived without quite asking your permission. The dream is over, but the dreamer remains. This is what the Soviet collapse was, for the people inside it. Not the clean ending that the calendar suggests, not the definitive before and after of the history books, but a threshold, a long disorienting threshold between one kind of life and another kind, neither of which was fully chosen, and both of which left marks. And the marks persist. In the people who were there, in the children of the people who were there, in the culture that grew in the soil of that particular century, in that particular way. The dissident poet Joseph Brodsky, who was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1972, who spent the rest of his life in the West, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1987, wrote in a late essay, something that has stayed with me in thinking about all of this. He wrote that the purpose of a great civilization is not to make its subjects comfortable, but to make them free. Free in the deepest sense, free to think what they actually think, to say what they actually believe, to live in correspondence with what they genuinely are rather than with what they have been told to perform. He was writing about the Soviet Union, which had expelled him, but he was writing more broadly than that. He was writing about the relationship between any system and the people it contains. The Soviet Union failed this test. It failed it comprehensively, over decades, in ways that cost millions of lives and corrupted the interior life of generations. But it failed it in a way that teaches something, teaches it with the concentrated, painful precision that only genuine catastrophe can, about what this test is and why it matters, and what it costs when a civilization fails it. We are not beyond this test. We do not live, any of us, in a world so secure in its relationship to truth that the Soviet warning is purely historical. There are still gaps between what is said and what is seen. There are still private ledgers being filled. There are still performances of belief, maintained in various registers, for various reasons, at various costs, in various corners of every society on Earth. The difference, perhaps, is one of degree of the distance between the gap and the catastrophe, of the mechanisms available for correcting and protesting and adjusting the story before the dam cracks. But the mechanisms must be used. They must be valued. They must be defended not only because they are practically useful, but because they represent at their core the commitment to a certain kind of seriousness. The seriousness of people who believe that what is true matters, that the difference between what is said and what is real matters, that the work of bringing public speech into correspondence with lived reality is not a luxury, but a necessity. A necessity for the health of institutions, and a necessity more intimate, more personal, and perhaps more important for the health of the individual soul. The Soviet Union is gone. It has been gone for 30 years, but the question it poses, the question of what a society built on performed belief costs, in human terms, at the level of individual integrity and collective sanity, that question is not gone. It has not been filed away in the archive of resolved historical problems. It lives in the post-Soviet world, in all its complicated manifestations, and it lives in smaller but no less real forms everywhere that the gap between the story and the reality is maintained by pressure rather than by truth. The old woman watching the flag come down goes to sleep. The dream is over. The apartment is real. Outside, the snow falls on the streets of a city that is no longer what it was an hour ago. And somewhere in the city, in 1,000 apartments, people are sitting with a feeling they have no word for yet. The feeling that comes when the world you have lived in is suddenly, irreversibly rearranged. When the coordinates shift, when the map no longer matches the territory, they will find words for it. Eventually, or their children will, or their children's children, who will grow up in whatever comes next, who will carry in their bodies the imprint of this moment without fully understanding it. The way we all carry in our bodies the imprints of moments we did not witness, but that shaped the world we were born into. The weight of what was. The question of what to do with it. The snow falls. The flag is down. The question remains.